Imagine spending a year's salary on a single first-class ticket for your daughter, only for a billionaire to have you dragged to the back of the plane like trash. Lucas Bennett didn't fight back, but as he was shoved into row 44, he felt a vibration through his boots that made his blood run cold. He tried to warn the crew, but the billionaire laughed, calling him a delusional janitor. 10 minutes later, the cabin lights died, the oxygen masks dropped, and the woman who stole his seat realized she hadn't just bought a seat, she had silenced the only man who knew the plane was about to disintegrate. But you won't believe the terrifying secret Lucas found when the plane finally hit the dirt. If your life depended on the person you just humiliated, would you expect them to save you, or would you expect them to let you burn? You need to see what happened next. If this story resonates with you, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, Lucas and I will be giving you another story just as crazy as this one. You don't want to miss it. Now, let us begin. The fluorescent lights of the international terminal hummed with a clinical, relentless energy. For Lucas Bennett, that hum usually signaled the end of a grueling night shift, the sound of a mop bucket being emptied. But today, it was the sound of a promise kept. Lucas adjusted the strap of his weathered duffel bag, his calloused thumb brushing against the smooth fabric of his daughter's jacket. Sophie, barely 7 and vibrating with an excitement that threatened to lift her off the linoleum, gripped his hand. "Is it really going to have beds, Daddy? On the plane?" Her voice was a high-pitched whisper of awe. Lucas smiled, a genuine, tired warmth reaching his handsome, rugged features. He wasn't a man of many words, but he was a man of his word. Not just beds, Soph. Warm cookies and movies that haven't even come out yet. We're traveling like royalty today. He felt the weight of his wallet in his back pocket. It was lighter than he liked, but the 2 first-class tickets inside represented 6 months of skipped meals and bone-deep exhaustion. He wanted her to see the world not from the basement window of their apartment, but from the clouds. Standing in the priority queue, Lucas felt the familiar sensation of being a ghost. People in tailored wool coats and Italian leather loafers looked through him, their gazes sliding off his clean but faded denim as if he were part of the architecture. Then the atmosphere changed. The air seemed to chill and sharpen as Morwenna Thorne arrived. She didn't walk, she carved a path through the crowd, a vision of severe, breathtaking beauty. Morwenna's hourglass figure was draped in a charcoal suit that cost more than Lucas's annual salary. She was on her phone, her voice low and melodic, but carrying the edge of a razor. "I don't care about the logistics, Marcus. I need the extra space for the prototype. If the cabin is full, find someone to move." She stopped directly behind Lucas, her scent, expensive jasmine and cold rain, masking the faint smell of industrial soap on his skin. To Morwenna, the man and the little girl in front of her were simply obstacles. She flicked a dismissive glance at Lucas's boarding pass, her eyes narrowing with a calculation that promised trouble. Have you ever worked tirelessly for a dream only to feel like someone more powerful could take it away in a second? How would you react if you were in Lucas's shoes right now? Let me know in the comments. The air inside the jet bridge was stale, smelling of jet fuel and heavy anticipation. Sophie's hand was a warm, slightly sweaty weight in Lucas's as they stepped onto the plush, deep navy carpet of the first-class cabin. For a fleeting second, Lucas allowed himself to breathe in the scent of polished leather and high-end upholstery. This was it, the reward for every aching muscle and every midnight shift. But as they reached their row, a flight attendant with a tight, flickering smile stepped into their path. "Mr. Bennett, I'm so sorry. There's been a last-minute operational adjustment," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the woman standing behind them. "Your seats have been reassigned to the main cabin, row 44, toward the rear." The words hit Lucas like a physical blow to the chest, momentarily knocking the wind out of him. Behind him, he heard the sharp, rhythmic click-clack of designer heels. Morwenna Thorne stepped forward, her presence a cold front moving through the pressurized cabin. She didn't even acknowledge Lucas as she handed an encrypted briefcase to her assistant. "Make sure the prototype is secured in the overhead of 2A," she commanded, her voice as smooth and lethal as a silk garrote. 2A was Lucas's seat. "I paid for these seats," Lucas said, his voice low and steady despite the sudden hot roar of blood in his ears. He held up the boarding passes, the paper crinkling audibly under the pressure of his calloused thumb. He wasn't just defending a piece of upholstery, he was defending the 6 months of his life he'd traded for this moment. Morwenna finally turned her gaze toward him. Her eyes were a piercing crystalline blue, breathtakingly beautiful and utterly devoid of empathy. She took in his worn boots, his clean but cheap shirt, and finally Sophie's wide, trembling eyes. "The airline has been more than compensated for the inconvenience," she said, her tone suggesting that any further discussion was a waste of her billion-dollar time. "It's a matter of global corporate security. I'm sure you understand. Priorities." She moved past him then, the silk of her scarf brushing his arm, a fleeting, expensive ghost of a touch that smelled of jasmine. The flight attendant refused to meet Lucas's gaze, gesturing toward the narrow, crowded aisle of economy. Sophie looked up at Lucas, the magic in her eyes replaced by a sharp, confused hurt. "Did I do something wrong, Daddy?" she whispered, her voice cracking. That was the bomb. Not the lost money, but the look on his daughter's face, the sudden crushing realization that in this world, some people simply mattered more than others. Lucas's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek as he forced a calm he didn't feel. He led Sophie toward the back of the plane, the luxury fading into the cramped, noisy reality of the rear rows. As he buckled her in, his eyes caught a flicker of something in the wings housing through the small, scratched window, a rhythmic, abnormal shudder that shouldn't have been there.
The economy cabin was a symphony of discomfort. The crying of a baby 3 rows back, the frantic clicking of laptop keys, and the stale heat of too many bodies in too small a space. Lucas sat with his knees pressed against the hard plastic of the seat in front of him, his arm around Sophie. He tried to focus on the cartoon playing on her small, flickering screen, but his entire body was tuned to the floorboards. There it was again, a low-frequency thrum, uneven and jagged, vibrating through the soles of his boots. It wasn't the steady drone of a healthy engine. It was the rhythmic grinding of metal starving for lubrication. "Daddy, the floor feels shaky," Sophie whispered, looking up from her tablet. Lucas didn't want to be that passenger. He knew how people looked at him, the man in the denim jacket who didn't belong in the front. If he spoke up now, they'd think he was just bitter about the seats. He tried to ignore it, telling himself the mechanics knew better than a man who spent his nights scrubbing the floors of an engineering firm. But Lucas Bennett knew machines. He knew that every machine had a voice, and this one was screaming. Driven by a restless instinct, Lucas unbuckled his seatbelt and made his way up the aisle. He reached the heavy curtain separating the classes. As he pulled it aside, the quiet luxury of first class felt like a different planet. Morwenna was hunched over her glowing screen, her fingers flying with a cold, clinical precision. "Excuse me," Lucas said, softly to the flight attendant near the galley. "There's a vibration coming from the starboard wing housing. It's inconsistent. You need to tell the cockpit." The attendant's smile didn't reach her eyes this time. It was layered with a weary condescension. "Sir, please return to your seat. The pilots are aware of all flight parameters." Morwenna didn't look up from her laptop, but her voice cut through the hum of the cabin like a blade. "Is he still complaining?" she asked, her tone dripping with bored irritation. "First, it was the seating. Now he's a structural engineer. Some people will do anything for a moment of attention." Lucas felt the heat rise in his neck. He looked at the back of her elegant dark head. "I'm a janitor, Miss Thorne. I spend 10 hours a night listening to industrial HVAC systems and turbine pumps. That sound isn't turbulence. It's a bearing failing." "It's a nuisance," Morwenna countered, finally turning to look at him, her eyes icy and dismissive. "Your expertise is noted, Mr. Bennett. Now go back to your daughter and let the professionals do their jobs so I can do mine." Lucas stood his ground for a heartbeat, the silence between them thick with unsaid truths. He saw the flicker of headache behind her eyes, a tiny crack in her armor,
but she quickly masked it with a scowl. He retreated, the resistance in his chest hardening into a cold, heavy lump. He had tried, but as he sat back down, the vibration transitioned from a thrum to a sharp metallic shudder that made the overhead bins rattle. The cabin lights flickered and died, replaced by the eerie, pulsing glow of floor-level emergency strips. A terrifying, grinding screech tore through the air, the sound of the bearing Lucas had warned about finally surrendering. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, devoid of its usual professional calm. "Brace for impact. We are making an emergency descent." The descent was a violent, stomach-churning blur. When the wheels finally kissed the tarmac of a remote secondary airstrip in the middle of a desert expanse, the plane didn't just stop, it shuddered as if it were breaking apart. Because of the high-security prototype Morwenna was carrying, the authorities didn't funnel the passengers into a terminal. Instead, they were ushered into a high-security, windowless concrete holding lounge, a relic of a Cold War-era military base. The room was small, humid, and smelled of old dust and ozone. Because Lucas had been the one to formally report the anomaly and Morwenna was the owner of the sensitive cargo, the security detail isolated them both in a smaller VIP annex for questioning, along with a terrified Sophie. Morwenna was pacing the length of the small room, her heels clicking like a metronome of anxiety on the concrete floor. Her phone had no signal. Her prototype was being inspected by men in suits. The transactional world she ruled had vanished. Here, her billions couldn't buy a faster exit or a working cell tower. "This is an absurdity," she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual bite. It trembled. She looked at the heavy steel door, then at Lucas, who was sitting on a low bench, pulling a small, battered book of fairy tales from his bag to distract Sophie. "You were right," she said suddenly. The admission seemed to cost her a physical price. She gripped her elbows as if holding herself together. "About the vibration. I should have listened." Lucas looked up. The dim, flickering light caught the rugged lines of his face, making him look older than his early 30s, yet remarkably steady. "It's not about being right, Miss Thorne. It's about getting home." "I don't even know if I have a home to get to," she whispered, almost to herself. She sat down on the far end of the bench, the charcoal silk of her suit looking out of place against the peeling gray paint. For the first time, she wasn't looking through him. She was looking at him, really looking, at the way he held Sophie, at the calm in his eyes that her money could never purchase. If you were stuck in a crisis with the person who had just humiliated you, would you help them or leave them to their own panic? Does pride matter when your life is on the line? Tell me your thoughts below.
The humid air in the concrete annex felt like a physical weight. Sophie had finally drifted into a fitful sleep, her head resting on Lucas's lap. Lucas watched her, his fingers gently smoothing her hair, his own face a mask of weary tenderness. More flickering light, the billionaire looked less like a titan of industry and more like a woman lost in the dark. "You're good with her," Morwenna said quietly, her voice echoing off the bare walls. "She trusts you completely. It's rare." Lucas didn't look up, his gaze fixed on his daughter. "She's all I've got, and I'm all she's got. Trust isn't a luxury for us, it's survival." He paused, his thumb tracing a scar on his palm, a reminder of a high-pressure pipe that had burst during a double shift. Her mother left when Sophie was barely 2, said she wasn't built for the quiet life of a man who smells like bleach and engine oil. I've been trying to make up for that void ever since. Morwenna looked away, her throat tightening. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small silver locket, turning it over in her fingers. "My father was a lot like that, except he didn't smell like bleach. He smelled like expensive scotch and old money. He used to say that people were either the gears that turned the world or the grease that made it easier for the gears to move." She gave a bitter, hollow laugh. "He taught me to be a gear, to be hard, cold, and efficient.
I spent my whole life making sure nobody ever looked at me and saw grease. I thought if I was powerful enough, I'd never be vulnerable again." She looked at Lucas's hands, rough, scarred, but incredibly gentle as he adjusted the makeshift pillow for Sophie. "I realized tonight, when the engine started screaming, that I've spent billions of dollars to build a life where I'm completely alone. When the lights went out, I didn't have anyone's hand to hold. I just had my prototype." Lucas finally looked at her, his dark, steady eyes searching hers. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a profound, quiet understanding. "Power doesn't keep you warm at night, Miss Thorne, and being a gear, well, even gears break if they don't have something to hold on to." A silence settled between them, not the tense, sharp silence of the airplane cabin, but something softer, more fragile. For a moment, the janitor and the billionaire were just two people sitting in the dark, stripped of their titles, sharing the weight of their own histories. The heavy, oppressive heat of the annex was broken by a sudden, cooling breeze that whistled through the high, narrow vents. Sophie stirred in her sleep, her eyelids fluttering open. She didn't cry. She simply looked at the gray walls, and then at Morwenna, who was watching her with an expression that was no longer guarded. "Daddy, I'm thirsty," Sophie whispered. Lucas reached for his water bottle, but it was bone dry. Before he could speak, Morwenna reached into her structured designer tote. Instead of a laptop or a legal brief, she pulled out a small, chilled bottle of premium sparkling water and a bar of dark chocolate wrapped in gold foil. "It's not exactly a warm cookie," Morwenna said, her voice holding a rare, self-deprecating lilt as she handed them to the girl. "But it's cold, and I'm told the chocolate is world-class." Sophie looked at Lucas for permission. He nodded, a small, surprised smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. As Sophie nibbled on the chocolate, her eyes wide with wonder, the tension that had defined the last several hours finally began to dissolve. "You're not as scary as you look on the news," Sophie mumbled around a mouthful of cocoa. Morwenna let out a short, genuine laugh, a sound that was surprisingly musical and light. "I'll take that as a compliment, Sophie. Most people in my boardroom would disagree." She looked at Lucas, her gaze lingering on the way the dim light caught the sharp line of his jaw and the kindness in his eyes. "Is this what you do? Fix things? Not just engines, but people?" "I just try to leave things cleaner than I found them," Lucas replied, a low rumble in the quiet room. "Whether it's a floor or a situation. It's not a billionaire's philosophy, I know." "Actually," Morwenna said softly, leaning in closer until he could smell the jasmine on her skin again, though it was now mixed with the heat of the desert, "it's the most sensible thing I've heard in years. I've spent my life building things that are unbreakable, but I forgot that the most important things are the ones that are already broken." For a moment, the concrete room didn't feel like a high-security holding cell. It felt like a sanctuary. Lucas shared a story about a time he'd accidentally locked himself in a supply closet with a stray kitten, and Morwenna countered with a disastrous attempt at cooking her own dinner that ended with a fire department visit. They laughed, a soft, shared sound that felt like healing. In the shadows of that abandoned base, a fragile, real bond was forming, a bridge across the vast canyon of class and status. The sanctuary of the annex was shattered when the steel door groaned open, letting in a flood of harsh white light and the heavy tread of combat boots. A man in a dark tactical vest, his face a mask of bureaucratic indifference, stepped in. Behind him, two assistants in suits scurried toward Morwenna, clutching satellite phones and tablets. "Miss Thorne, your legal team is on the line. The board is panicking about the prototype's exposure," the lead assistant hissed, ignoring Lucas and Sophie entirely. Morwenna stood up, and as she did, the warmth she had shared with Lucas seemed to evaporate, replaced by the rigid, diamond-hard exterior of the CEO. She took the satellite phone, her voice returning to that clipped, transactional tone. "I understand the liability. If the mechanical failure was due to sabotage, we need to identify the reporting party immediately." The security officer turned his gaze to Lucas. "You're the one who reported the vibration, Bennett? A janitor with no formal engineering degree? It's a bit convenient, isn't it, knowing exactly where the bearing was failing before the sensors even tripped?" Lucas felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He stood up, shielding Sophie. "I told you, I work with these machines every day. I know how they sound." "Or," the officer countered, his voice dripping with suspicion, "you're looking for a whistleblower payout, or worse, you're working for a competitor who wanted this flight grounded." Lucas looked at Morwenna, waiting for her to defend him. They had just shared their deepest scars. She knew he was a man of integrity. But Morwenna wouldn't meet his eyes. She was listening to her lawyer on the phone, her face pale and distant. The gear had taken over. "Miss Thorne?" Lucas asked, his voice a low, pained rumble. She finally looked at him, but her eyes were like shards of glass. "I have to consider the company's position, Lucas," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The authorities have to follow protocol. Your story, it is statistically unlikely. Perhaps it's best if you stay with the other passengers until the investigation is complete." The betrayal was sharper than any engine screech. Lucas felt the old, familiar weight of his status, the invisible man being pushed back into the shadows the moment the lights came back on. He realized that to her, he was still just grease when the world started turning again. "I see," Lucas said, his jaw tight, his dignity the only thing he had left. "Come on, Sophie, we're in the way of important business." Have you ever opened up to someone only to have them turn their back on you when things got complicated? Is it possible to truly bridge the gap between two different worlds, or are we always destined to return to our roles? Share your heart in the comments.
The transport bus hummed with a low, vibrating growl as it sat on the cracked tarmac, waiting to ferry the standard passengers to the nearest commercial hub. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale upholstery and the quiet murmurs of exhausted travelers. Lucas sat in the very last row, his arm draped protectively around Sophie. He stared out the window at the shimmering heat waves rising off the desert floor. He felt a profound, hollow weight in his chest, the kind that comes when you realize you've let your guard down for the wrong person. He had seen the flicker of the old Morwenna return, the billionaire who saw people as variables in an equation. He told himself it didn't matter. He was a janitor. He was used to being the help that was forgotten once the mess was cleaned. But as he looked at the empty seat beside him, his mind kept drifting back to the way she had laughed at his kitten story. Meanwhile, 50 yards away, Morwenna sat in the back of a black, climate-controlled SUV. Her lawyers were a constant buzz in her ear, discussing liability waivers and non-disclosure agreements. She looked at the silver locket in her palm, her fingers trembling. For the first time in her career, the gear was slipping. She saw the transport bus through the tinted glass, a cage for the man who had actually saved her life. "Miss Thorne, we need your signature on the authorization to detain the whistleblower for further questioning," her assistant said, handing her a tablet. Morwenna looked at the screen. Lucas's name was typed in a cold, sterile font. Lucas Bennett, the man who smelled like industrial soap and possessed a quiet strength she hadn't found in 1,000 boardrooms. She thought about his daughter's wide eyes. She thought about the grease that made her world turn. "Stop the car," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Ma'am, I said, stop the car." Morwenna's voice rang out with a command that wasn't born of corporate power, but of a desperate, newfound clarity. She didn't wait for the driver to open her door. She threw it open herself, the desert heat hitting her like a physical wall. She ran. Her designer heels sank into the soft asphalt, but she didn't care. She reached the bus just as the doors began to hiss shut. She pounded on the glass, her face pale, her dark hair coming loose from its perfect bun. The bus driver looked at her in shock, then at the black SUVs behind her. He opened the door. Morwenna stepped into the cramped, humid bus, her eyes searching the rows until they landed on the handsome, rugged man in the back. Lucas stood up slowly, his expression guarded. his jaw set in a line of hard, beautiful iron. "Lucas," she breathed, her voice breaking, I made the wrong choice. Please, don't go."
The silence on the transport bus was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the idling engine. Morwenna stood in the cramped aisle, her chest heaving, her silk blouse smudged with desert dust. The passengers, the very people she had looked through only hours before, were now witnesses to her undoing. She didn't look like a billionaire. She looked like a woman who had finally found her soul and was terrified of losing it again. "I withdrew the statement," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "The investigation is closed. I told them the truth, that you're the reason we're all standing on this ground and not scattered across it." She took a step closer to Lucas, her eyes pleading. "I spent my whole life choosing the priority that had a $sign attached to it. But when I saw this bus starting to pull away, I realized I was letting the only real thing I've felt in years drive out of my life." Lucas looked at her, his rugged face softening. The iron in his jaw didn't vanish, but the wall he had built after her betrayal began to crumble. He saw the disheveled hair, the discarded heels, and the raw vulnerability in her crystalline blue eyes. She wasn't a gear anymore. She was just Morwenna. "I'm just a man who scrubs floors, Morwenna," Lucas said softly, his voice an emotional echo of their first encounter. "I don't fit in your world." "Then let me into yours," she whispered. She reached out, her hand hovering near his before he finally closed the gap, his calloused hands lacing with hers. The contrast was striking, the rough hand of a laborer and the soft hand of a mogul, but for the first time they fit. 2 weeks later, the sun set over a quiet park near Sophie's grandmother's house. Lucas sat on a bench watching Sophie run through the grass. A familiar scent of jasmine and cold rain caught the breeze. He turned to see Morwenna approaching, wearing a simple sundress and a smile that finally reached her eyes. She wasn't there for a prototype or a seat. She was there for him. She sat beside him, handing him a warm container of cookies, real ones this time. "I realized I had my priorities wrong for a long time," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "It turns out the best view isn't from a first-class seat. It's right here." Lucas put his arm around her, the single dad and the billionaire finally finding the one thing money couldn't buy, a home in each other. Sometimes the person we think is our enemy is actually the one who helps us see who we truly are. Have you ever had an unexpected love change your life? Tell us your story below. Thank you for watching another story of Lucas Bennett to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as wild and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So like the video and subscribe for more, because Lucas and I will be waiting for you tomorrow.